Good evening. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight, John McCormack. So I'll try to do that briefly. John McCormack is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, which I think goes by IUPUI. That is the longest title I've ever heard of a college. Since 2010, John has held a Jean Monnet Chair from the European Commission at IUPUI. And in 2013, he was also the Fulbright Schumann Chair in U.S.-EU politics at the College of Europe. John is the author of 12 books and multiple book chapters and articles. He's written 7 textbooks that have been published in 24 editions in 7 languages. That's a lot of scholarship. But I also want to say John is not just a great scholar, he's also a great teacher. He has won 3 university teaching awards. And for many years, John has organized the Midwest Model European Union. He's one of the founders of that organization, and it brings together students from across the Midwest, and they do a simulation where they represent different European Union countries, and they negotiate policy. That leadership position is now passed on to someone else, but Grand Valley is one of the schools that participates in the European Union simulation, and it's a really great learning experience, and so we're really glad that John and some of his colleagues had initiated that important process. So I just want to welcome to the podium John McCormack and thank him and recognize him as both a scholar and a teacher.
Thanks, Polly. Well, thank you very much. Pleased to be here. This is the 3rd time I've been to Grand Rapids at the behest of Dixie 3 times, I think, and I feel like I'm in really good company after that wonderful award that you received there. So thank you for having me back again, Dixie. And I think the first time I stood about there, so that was 2008 that I think that I was here. So the future of Europe. I'm a political scientist. Those of us who deal with European Union studies have been through a sustained phase of depression over the last 10, 15 years. It's been pretty bad news on the European front. These are the sorts of things that we have to deal with in my business. These are just 3 books that I pulled off Amazon that give you a taste of the kind of conversations that are taking place in the European Union. The End of the Euro, Europe's Last Chance, which has just come out, and Crisis in the Eurozone. So this is fairly typical of the tone of the discussion about the EU. I am an eternal optimist, and as is Andy Moravchik, who wrote the article on the future of Europe in this year's Great Decisions. So we're unfortunately in a minority. But I still think that the European Union is going to do very well in spite of its recent problems. This is my favorite Economist cover from a few years back at the depths of the Eurozone crisis in Greece. If you know the movie Apocalypse Now, Acropolis Now, Europe's debt crisis spins out of control. And if you can just see it down there, Angela Merkel, the horror. But unfortunately, this has been the nature of the conversation about the EU, but those of us in the field try to soldier on regardless. So first of all, just a very quick history of the EU, where it came from. It's been around in one form or another since the early 1950s, began in 1952 as a thing called the European Coal and Steel Community, which was an effort to try and bring the coal and steel industries of European countries together as a means to achieving broader cooperation. So 6 countries joined, West Germany, France, Italy, and the 3 Benelux countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Then in 1958, it expanded to become the European Economic Community with the same 6 countries as members. The purpose of the European Economic Community was to try and build a European single market to bring down barriers to trade and freedom of movement and people and goods and services. In the 1970s and 1980s, the membership expanded. Britain joined in 1973, and I'll come back shortly and talk about Brexit. In the early 1990s, the EEC morphed into this thing called the European Union. More countries joined. The biggest, most significant membership increase was in 2004, when it went up to 25 members with an increase of countries from Eastern Europe, which was politically and economically significant, including 3 countries that had been formerly parts of the Soviet Union. So Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined in 2004. And then the most recent member was Croatia in 2013. So that's where we are, 28 member states in the EU. Several countries lined up as potential future members, what are called candidate countries, which have been accepted in principle for membership, but now the conversations and the negotiations are taking place on the exact terms of that membership. So Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Turkey are all considered candidate countries and therefore have the prospect of joining at some point in the future. Not so much Turkey, I don't think, anymore. Turkey's had some problems recently, and its move towards more authoritarian government does not work in its favor, but we'll have to see. So this is a map of what the EU looks like now. The 28 countries, several countries on the edge there, that the Balkan countries and Turkey. Iceland had been a candidate country, but they decided they weren't quite as enthusiastic as before because of concerns about what happened during the global financial crisis. And I suppose we should put the UK now in hash marks, since it is about to this week start negotiating the terms of exit. So there are 40 countries in Europe, of which 20 of the EU. And just to give you some comparative numbers here with the United States, the population of the EU is just over 500 million. Our population is about 320 million. Packed into an area about half the size of the United States. If you've been to Europe, you know it's a really crowded place. A lot of people in a small area. In terms of the size of the economies, if you add up the 28 countries, the gross domestic product comes to about the same as that of the United States. So the US and the EU are by far the biggest or the wealthiest marketplaces in the world. I mean, obviously China and India are much bigger, but they're also significantly poorer. And then in terms of the role that these entities play in world trade, the EU accounts for about 15% of world merchandise trade, which is slightly more than that of the United States. So these are the two major trade powers in the world. In terms of what the European Union is, it's really difficult to answer that question because there's never been anything like it. And most of the typical explanations of how international organizations or political institutions work do not apply to the European Union. It's more than a standard international organization, so it does much more than, say, the United Nations, for example, or the World Trade Organization. It has some common institutions based in Brussels, primarily, but these institutions do not constitute a European Union government. They constitute a system of governance, which is somewhat different from the formal institutions that you would have with government. So even though they look like a European Union government, they really aren't. There's something less than that. This is not a federal United States of Europe. There are some people that would like it to be, and some people who back in the 1950s hoped that it would be at some point in the future, but it's stopped short of being a federal US of Europe. It could, at some point in the future, become that, but there's a lot of people that would prefer that didn't happen. So there's a difference of opinion about where it's headed. I like to think of it as a confederation, which is a looser union of independent states that come together and work on things where it makes sense for them to cooperate. So if people ask me what the European Union is, quick answer, it's a confederal system with federal qualities. And that completely flummoxes everybody. And then most people in academia that deal with the European Union would absolutely deny it's a confederal system. But I think it perfectly fits the idea of a confederal system, which may eventually become a federal system at some point in the future. By the way, this picture here is of the European Parliament building in Brussels, to give you an example of one of the institutions that the EU has. They have an open market among those 28 countries, so there's free movement of people, money, goods, and services among these 28, almost entirely free. There are some conditions. They have a common trade policy, so the 28 countries, when the US trade representative negotiates with the EU, they don't negotiate with the 28 countries, they negotiate with the European Commissioner for Trade. So there's a common trade policy, which makes these countries very powerful. There's a shared foreign policy. They've been trying to build a common foreign policy, but they haven't really got to that point yet. There's no European Union military, and there's quite a lot of resistance against that idea. There's no common police force, and there's no European Union tax. So you can see there are some elements of a political system like the United States, but in some ways the European Union is significantly different. And at the end of the day, the 28 countries are still sovereign states, which is not the case with Michigan or Indiana. In terms of the crises that they've had, Jean Monnet, who was one of the founders of the EU, talked a long time ago about the inevitability of crisis within the EU. He said this wasn't going to be a simple project. There was going to be problems inevitably because no group of countries had ever tried to do what the EU has been trying to do. So he talked about the inevitability of crises, and he also said that these crises can be overcome, and ultimately what the EU would become would be the sum of these problems. And there have been many crises along the way. I could give you several slides of crises, but I just picked some of the really big ones and some of the recent ones because there's been some particularly troublesome problems for the EU recently. So 2007, the global financial crisis. Many European Union financial institutions were heavily invested in the subprime mortgage market in this country, and so the problems that we had spilled over to the European Union very, very quickly, and banks in the EU and financial institutions had difficulties, which then spread to other parts of the economy. 2009, you had the breaking of the debt crisis. To try and explain that simply is just simply impossible, but can I give it a shot? They should never have let Greece in. Period. So it really essentially came from the fact that the euro was badly designed and they didn't employ the rules they had set themselves for membership of the euro. So countries like Greece, which had not have been allowed into the euro, were allowed in, and then one thing led to another, and then you had this crisis in the eurozone. Then in 2015, you had the refugee crisis in the wake of the Syrian civil war. Now, the European Union has faced refugee crises and illegal immigration for a long time. It's a magnet for immigrants, but this was a particularly bad one and caused a lot of difficulties within the EU. You know, what do we do about all of these refugees? How do we divide the refugees up among the 28 member states? And then lastly, last year in 2016, when Britain had a vote on whether they wanted to remain part of the EU and decided not to. So the Brexit vote became probably the biggest crisis that the EU has ever faced and is now currently trying to work its way through. So the EU has done a lot of useful, interesting, and remarkable things along the way, but it's also faced a difference of opinion about the direction it should be taking. And there has been a growth of what is called Euroscepticism, particularly since the 1990s, when this new treaty was signed called the Maastricht Treaty, which created this thing called the European Union. And many people felt that this was too much, and that the euro, the single currency, was also a step too far. And so what you saw from the 1990s was a resistance among many Europeans to the idea of integration. Now, there's lots of opinions within this concept of Euroscepticism. So there are some people that would like their countries to leave the European Union altogether. There are some people that say, well, we'll stay in, but we need to change the EU because it's not as efficient or as effective as we'd like it to be. So there's lots of different opinion. But the kind of Euroscepticism that we've seen develop over the last 10 years or so overlaps with these three things in particular. So there's been concerns about immigration. There's been concerns about globalization to the extent that anybody can really define what globalization means, especially on a sort of a day-to-day basis. What impact is it going to have on my job? And then there's been a reaction against the political elite and politics as usual and the political class. If any of this rings familiar, there's a direct overlap here with what Donald Trump was saying and the kind of concerns that had people voting for Donald Trump. When Brexit happened, the day after Brexit happened, I knew that Donald Trump was going to be the next president of the United States. Unless anything changed dramatically between then and the election, for the same reasons, I think. I think a lot of people voted for Trump for the same motivation as they voted to leave the European Union. A couple of points to bear in mind when looking at public opinion and how it's evolved and how people have segued their views about immigration and globalization into their opinion about the European Union. First of all, is that a lot of people, okay, you can't see that very clearly, but it's a graph showing public opinion over time about the extent to which people understand the European Union. So they have a polling service in the EU called Eurobarometer, which has 2 big annual surveys, and one of the questions they ask people is, how much do you actually understand the EU? And you'll see that it's about 50-50. So the statement there is, I understand how the EU works. About 54% totally agree, 42% totally disagree. So approximately half of Europeans feel they actually understand how the EU works, and about the other half doesn't understand how the EU works. And yet, they still have opinions about it, and they still vote in referendums like the Brexit referendum. And then the other one, which I guess you can't also see all that clearly, this is asking people, to what extent do you trust the European Union, and to what extent do you trust your national government? And what you see, the blue line there is how much I trust the European Union. They've all come down. So trust in the EU has come down. Trust in national government, which is the grey one, has also come down. So you see that Europeans are going through the same kind of changes that we are here, where trust in government has declined. But interestingly, trust in the EU has always been above that in trust in national government. And I'm not quite sure what conclusions we can draw from that, but this is like, there's a fairly bright spot here, relatively speaking, for the European Union. So to turn to Brexit, and I should just say up front, I'm not going to be in the slightest bit objective about this. Even though I've lived in this country for just over 30 years, I'm originally from the UK. I still have a British passport along with my US passport. And I think this Brexit vote was the stupidest thing the British people have done probably in their history. It was a terrible, terrible decision that they made. I'm angry. I'm disappointed, I'm depressed, I'm fed up, I'm shocked, I'm all of the words that fit in with that general idea. I think this was a shocking decision on their part, which they will live to regret. And the people that tended to vote for Brexit are the ones that are going to be hurt the most as a result of these decisions. But, okay, let me go back to being a little bit more subjective here. What happened? Well, over time, Britain had joined the European Union in 1973, but the British have always been resistant to the idea of European integration. The British have always thought of themselves as different. We're an island state. We have to come in occasionally to sort out your wars, and then we go home. We go on vacation to Europe, which I've always found the strangest thing. If Britain is in Europe, so how can you go on vacation to Europe? So they've always had this different view about being part of the European Union. And they joined in January 1973, and within 18 months they had a national referendum on whether they wanted to stay. So that should have told you something. However, that 1975 referendum was not what it seems. It seems like it was an opportunity for the British people to say yes or no to what the government had done in their name. But actually what was happening here was that the government at that time, the Labour government with Harold Wilson as Prime Minister, the Labour Party was having a big internal fight about Europe, with some of its members were in favour of what was then the European Economic Community and some were opposed. So Harold Wilson said, oh, I've had enough of this arguing. Instead of us continuing to just tear ourselves to pieces, let's have a national vote. Let's ask the British people what they think. So that's what happened. They had the 1975 referendum, do you want to stay? And by about roughly 2/3 to 1/3 split, the British people said, yes, we want to stay. So at that point, Prime Minister Harold Wilson said, well, okay, the fight is over. The people have spoken. Can we get on with governing? So that was fine. Then the Conservatives split. Starting in the 1980s, there was infighting within the Conservative Party about membership of the EU. And Margaret Thatcher famously was right at the middle of that. And part of the reason actually why Margaret Thatcher lost her position as Prime Minister was because she was unable to resolve the fight within her party over membership of the European Union. So David Cameron becomes Prime Minister. And he says, I've had enough of fighting within the party, so I'm going to do more or less what Harold Wilson did. We'll have another vote. We'll put it to the people and see what the people think. And he fully expected that the people would say, yes, of course we will stay. So he really kind of took that result for granted. So this is kind of interesting. The original question that was proposed to be on the referendum was, do you think that the UK should be a member of the European Union? Okay, so that looks fairly innocuous. But the UK Electoral Commission, which oversees these kinds of things, looked at this and said, we have a concern about that question because we think there's enough people in Britain that do not know that the UK is already a member of the European Union, that they will be able to make a choice on the basis of that question. So I think as soon as that was revealed, people should have realized there was going to be a problem. So anyway, they changed the wording. And the campaign was launched. So the referendum question in the end was, do you want to leave or do you want to remain? So it became leave versus remain. Again, I'm clearly very much opposed to the concept of Brexit. I set up my own Facebook page where I campaigned against Brexit, and I had 35,000 likes by the time the referendum came along, which I thought was pretty good. I was quite proud about that. I spent about 2.5 years trying to deal with people on Facebook and trying to argue with them why Brexit was going to be a terrible idea and why they just simply didn't understand how the EU worked. The Leave campaign really misrepresented the costs of membership, and I'm being polite here by using the word misrepresentation. I'd rather use the word they lied outright or came up with alternative facts or however else you want to put it. But frankly, the campaign was based on all sorts of misconceptions about what membership of the European Union meant for Britain. And then when it came to the actual referendum itself, I think a lot of people voted not because they had an opinion one way or the other, but because they wanted to register a protest vote against politics, against government, against the government of the day. And I think most people probably felt that Britain was not going to leave. So there would be no harm in just having a little protest vote. And it would go there as, under the one column, but it wouldn't have any long-lasting effect. Well, big surprise for everybody. The poll suggested right up until the very last minute that the vote would be to stay. But the end result was that 52% voted to leave and 48% to stay. But a significant number of people also did not vote. So we have to take that into account as well. So only about 1/3, 35 to 40% of people actually voted to leave. Everybody else voted to stay or didn't vote at all. And then since then, the British government has been struggling. There was some immediate fallout. So David Cameron, the Prime Minister, had to resign immediately because he'd staked to some extent his political reputation on a win. The British pound fell dramatically and has not really recovered since then. Theresa May has taken over as Prime Minister. She campaigned to stay, but very unconvincingly. And since becoming Prime Minister, she seems to have really switched to the Leave side. The Labour Party, which is the main opposition party in Britain, did almost nothing during the campaign, which disappointed a lot of people. And now they've decided maybe they're going to try and campaign a little bit more vigorously for the best possible deal when Britain does leave. So just to give you an example of the kind of misrepresentations that were out there, this bus has come to symbolize the worst part of the referendum campaign. So the Leave campaign put this bus together. And it says on the side, we send the EU £300 million a week. Let's fund our National Health Service instead. Well, there's several problems with this, starting with the fact that this £350 million a week is simply not true. This was a gross over-representation of how much British membership of the EU cost in just simply financial terms. £350 million a week is about $500 million, which sounds like a lot, and it is, but you have to think what you get back for that. The actual figure was about half. So it was about £173 million per week, say $260 million. But the Leave campaign doubled the figure. And I know how they did it. They just didn't account for certain payments that came back to the EU, and they just meddled with the numbers and came up with this spectacular figure. And then saying, well, we can take this £350 million a week and immediately channel it all into the National Health Service. I mean, you can't make that kind of argument. Even if you were able to save this kind of money, there's going to be all sorts of claims on where it's going to be spent. So this was just a gross misrepresentation of what happened, or what the costs would be. And by the way, the Leave campaign has subsequently gone back on this and said, no, it wasn't true after all. Okay, so in terms of why Brexit is a bad idea, first of all, you have a referendum that's based on misunderstandings, put before a population that admits that many of whom admit they don't actually understand how the EU works. A lot of the problems that have been blamed on the EU by the Leave campaign were not actually the fault of the European Union. The EU was just a handy scapegoat that they were able to focus on and say, if we stay in the EU, it's going to cost us all of these kinds of problems. Many of these were just not true. With Britain outside the EU, it's going to lose the kind of access it has to the single market. It will still have access to the single market, and it will still have to meet the terms of European Union law in order to have that access, but it's not going to be participating in the decision-making about the single market. It's going to be like Norway, which is on the outside of the EU, but is very much involved with the European market, but cannot make any of the decisions involving the European market. It must simply go along with what the EU tells it to do. The EU itself is going to lose the UK as a major partner, and that's going to be problematic in political, economic, diplomatic, all sorts of terms. The UK will continue to have to react to European Union policy. It's right next door. It's going to be still very heavily involved with the European Union, but will have to react to what the EU does, rather than helping shape European Union policy. Britain by itself is going to be much smaller and less influential in the world than it has been as a member of this much bigger club of countries. Britain is going to be much less attractive to foreign investors. Britain has done extremely well out of its membership of the EU because so many American companies and Japanese companies and companies from other parts of the world that are investing in the EU have preferred to use the UK as their base for a variety of reasons, not least of which is common language. When Britain leaves the EU, it's going to have to do its own trade deals. So all of the trade agreements that it is part of within the EU with, say, the United States or the Chinese or Japan, it's now going to have to do bilateral deals with all of these other countries, plus the 27 other EU countries. So this is going to be an enormous task to get this done. And to get it done in terms that Britain feels happy with is going to be even more difficult. The impact on London as a financial centre is going to be dramatic. London is already the world's leading financial centre, but it's going to lose a lot of the benefits that it has being part of the European Union. There's already been talk about financial companies closing down, moving jobs from London to Frankfurt and Paris and places like that, and that will continue to be a problem. And then Brexit really feeds into, I think, the worst aspects of nationalism that we've found in Europe over the last several hundred years, and the kind of nationalism that feeds into conflict and war. One of the great advantages of the European Union is that it's brought the Europeans together, and they cooperate and they talk to each other and they work together, rather than arguing and fighting and going to war with one another. And then finally, Brexit could mean the end of the UK. So there's been a lot of speculation about this, but when we look at the votes and how different parts of the UK voted, Scotland, up there on the top, 2% to remain and 38% to leave. Dramatically different from the overall figure for the UK. Northern Ireland also 56 to remain and 44% to leave. So Britain is split within itself. London also went very much for remaining. So Scotland had an independence referendum a few years ago, and that should have been the end of that, but now the Scottish National Party has decided that since there was such a big difference here between the way Scotland went and the rest of the UK went, they would like to have another referendum, possibly towards the end of next year. And if things continue the way they are now, it's quite likely that Scotland will vote for independence. Northern Ireland is a much more troublesome arrangement because one of the reasons why Northern Ireland has been at peace over the last 20 years or so is that there's essentially no border now between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And with the UK leaving, they would have to reinstitute that border. So there would be border posts and customs and immigration and all sorts of things along that border, which could actually lead to a breakout again of this social conflict, civil conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. Last week, somebody in the Welsh National Party talked about, well, maybe Wales should try to become independent as well. And then maybe London should be set up as a special administrative zone like Hong Kong. That's just my little joke on that one. I mean, you know, London is so heavily networked in with the rest of the EU that if it's taken out, it's going to cause it all kinds of problems. So Brexit could mean the end of the UK. So in terms of the future of the European Union, it's very difficult to say what's going to happen over the next 5, 10, 15 years. Like I said earlier on, I remain optimistic. I think that the benefits of the EU are sufficient that the kinds of problems that the Europeans have faced can be resolved simply because it's too big to fail, if you like. So I think it will continue to move along the same path it's been following over the last 50 years, obviously with a big adjustment to deal with the fact that the UK might be leaving. Euroscepticism might spread. It already has. So you've seen the rise of anti-European movements in other countries, France being a prime example of that. But it could be that other European countries look at what happened with Brexit. They look at Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not popular in the European Union. And they look at Putin, who's also not very popular in the European Union. And they say, well, in a world of great uncertainty, with other countries being led by governments that we don't really like or have concerns about, perhaps we should work more closely together. And the costs of leaving may become so abundantly clear in the case of Britain that the other countries might say, well, we don't want to do that. So there's all the more reason why we should work more closely together. It's also worth remembering that the European Union won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012. So one of the great achievements, I think, of European integration has been this, the fact that they've been at peace since 1945, general peace. There's been disputes, but the Europeans have not been at war with each other since 1945, and the EU has been a large part of the reason why that has happened. The EU is a trade and economic superpower, and that kind of power that it has is not going to go away anytime soon or quickly. In fact, it's going to continue to expand as other countries join the EU. Other countries must concede to what EU policy says. So even though the EU may be having difficulties, if you want access to the European market, you have to pay attention to what the EU wants. And I thought it's kind of interesting, driving up this morning on NPR, there was a local story from Michigan Public Radio about how the EU has just approved a merger between DuPont and Dow Chemical, $130 billion merger. And I think people might listen to that and say, well, what has the European Union got to do with a merger between two big American corporations? Well, if those corporations want to do business in the EU, they have to meet the terms of EU policy. And so the EU has blocked mergers between American companies before because they were concerned about the creation of a big new company that had too big of a share of the market. The euro is also recovering. I mean, it's been through some bad times, and it was, as I said earlier, it was badly designed. So they've fixed some of the design flaws, and they've introduced some new institutions to help offset potential future problems with the euro. And then at the end of the day, Brexit might not happen. I think it's still possible that over the next 2 years, while Britain negotiates with the other countries and looks at the terms of Brexit, the costs of leaving may become so enormous that there may be a reaction against it, and the whole thing may just fall apart, and the British may say, sorry, that was a mistake. Can we not leave now, please? And it's also it's worth remembering that the referendum last year was an advisory referendum. So the British government was not compelled by the result of the referendum vote to leave. It could have said, well, we've heard what you've said, and we're concerned, and we'll try and do something about it. But there's no compulsion, legal compulsion, on Britain to leave the European Union. So next 2 years is going to be very interesting to see what happens. And of course, if Britain doesn't leave, then that will change the story significantly. And then finally, just a quick chart here, a Eurobarometer poll from last year. I don't know if you can see that, but it asks people, would you say that you are very optimistic, fairly pessimistic, or very pessimistic about the future of the EU? And the blue bars are the ones for the optimistic people. So the EU 28, which is about a third of the way along there, it's 54% optimistic, 44% pessimistic. And then you go on down the line to the Irish, who are very optimistic about the future of the European Union. So they're at one end. Strangely enough, the Greeks are at the other end. High levels of pessimism about the future of the EU. But overall, that paints a fairly positive picture. It suggests that in most countries, there's a significant majority of people that still remain optimistic about the future of the European Union. So we'll have to wait and see. So with that, I will just post that map of the European Union, and I will stop at that point, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. McCormick. At this time, we'd like to ask the audience to ask some questions. So as we do, you can either come down to the microphones or you can text me questions, and I'll ask on your behalf. The phone number is 616-308-6560. And I've got a question to get us started. You mentioned a bit about the costs that the UK paid in to stay within the EU. Has there been an attempt to calculate the cost in terms of benefits that the UK received being in the European Union? And does that balance out?
The direct financial costs or
Yes.
the other broader ones?
Well, right. I mean, how do you calculate some of these things? But yeah, some direct financial costs.
Well, that figure of 350 million, what that didn't indicate was that Britain gets an automatic rebate every year that Margaret Thatcher negotiated back in the 1980s. So Britain pays money in and immediately gets a big chunk back. And it was the only way that I suppose they could keep Margaret Thatcher pliable back in the 1980s. And then in addition to that, that money goes into the European Union budget, and then it's spent in the 28 countries, and a large part of that comes back to the UK. So once you add in the rebate plus the EU spending in the UK, which is significant, and then you work out the balance, that's where the numbers change significantly.
Not only do you might have buyer's remorse, but there are a number of people in this country also that have buyer's remorse after the election. My question, though, is with the Brexit vote and the number of people that do have that, wait a minute, we didn't really understand it, we made a mistake, do you think that will strengthen other countries' resolve and citizens in other countries to stay within the European Union now that they can see maybe we don't want to do this, there are consequences?
No, absolutely. I think one of the silver lining here is that I mentioned that a lot of Europeans don't understand how the EU works. Well, the Greek financial crisis actually provided a really good series of lessons, and people paid more attention to the EU and learned more about it. And I think that's exactly what is happening now in many countries, is they're actually paying more attention and learning more about how the EU works and what it does. And I'm confident that as you learn more about it, you learn more about the benefits of it. And I struggle really to think of a single benefit that Britain will get out of leaving. Honestly, it's not just me being biased, but I can't think of a single thing where Britain is going to be better off. And I think I'm reasonably optimistic that quite a few people in other European countries are going to have the same kind of thinking.
So you said that lots of foreign investment that is currently in the UK generally and in London in particular, presumably that'll be going to particular countries and cities in the EU. Who are the winners going to be if that money, that investment is not going to be in London or in the UK?
Well, it's going to be case by case, company by company and country by country, but with the benefits of being present in Britain no longer being there and being part of the European single market, many companies will still stay in the UK because the benefits are clear, but they're going to be redistributing to other parts of the EU for sure, getting closer to their markets, being part of the European single market, which Britain will not be anymore.
Mr. McCormick, tonight you mentioned one of the problems in Europe as far as pressure on the European Union was the problem with immigration. And you didn't address that, later in your remarks. And I just wonder with resurgence in France of Marine Le Pen and her possibly winning the first ballot and going on the second ballot and probably not winning, but where do you see the immigration challenge in Europe? How do you see that evolving over the coming years?
Well, it's a problem, and it's going to become more and more of a problem. The Europeans face very similar pressures to those that we face. They've got more of a refugee problem than I think that we have, because they're closer to some of the more troubled parts of the world. They have an illegal immigration problem just like we do. Europeans have always immigrated to each other's countries, but what has happened over the last couple of generations is that immigrants look different. So racially and ethnically they look different religions, and these kinds of things are bringing pressure to bear. And Europeans like to think of themselves as progressive, but I think increasingly they're being tested in terms of actually fulfilling their progressive ideas and beginning to see racism, Islamophobia, these kinds of things are rising. So how to resolve these, I don't know. But cutting yourself off and taking yourself out of the European Union is not really going to help, because Britain will still continue to face the same kinds of pressures. And the other thing about immigration is that the British move to the rest of the EU just like other people in the rest of the EU move to Britain. So there's about 2 million British people who live in other parts of the EU. And there's a big question now about, what's their future? Are they going to have to get visas? Are they going to have to get special status to remain where they are? Are they going to have difficulty moving their money, their pension funds, whatever it is, those kinds of things? So, immigration is much more complicated than the Brexit folks would indicate with just people coming into Britain.
Yeah, you touched a tad on nationalism and how Putin and Trump are nationalists, right? I was at a great discussion a couple of months ago. It talked about how Putin is pushing on the countries that border Russia, and they don't really align with the Western Europeans who are strong for the EU because they still have heritable ties to when the Russian regime was larger. So he's trying to draw them away from the EU, and how could that affect the EU if, like, the Finnish were to leave, or the Estonians, the Lithuanians, never known below it, but how would that affect them?
They won't leave.
They won't?
No. That would, if Finland and the Baltic countries leave, then anything is possible. It's almost impossible to imagine that they would. Finland has no particular desire to be under the control of the Russians like it has been in the past. There's a lot of Russians that live in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. That's a problem. But the other thing to remember is that most of these countries are members of NATO as well. So even if Putin tries to put pressure on them for political or economic reasons, if he starts becoming militarily belligerent, then NATO becomes the factor. And if Russia attacks or starts to interfere with the Baltic countries, then we are obligated as members of NATO to come to their defense. And at the end of the day, I think Putin realizes that. So.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have some text from the audience, and some of this is highlighted by the question from the previous gentleman, but perhaps you could comment a little bit on populism in some of the EU countries and how that is kind of the future you see, say, in France and Germany, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, populism is on the rise, and it has a lot of overlap with the populism we've seen here with Donald Trump. It's difficult to know how it's going to work out over the longer term. Over the short term, we just had the election in the Netherlands where the populist Geert Wilders didn't do as well as many people thought he was going to do. Now we have an election coming up in France where it's conceivable that Marine Le Pen, they have a 2-round presidential election, so it's conceivable that she will make it to the second round. But there is a new candidate in the center of French politics who's been very popular, very pro-EU, young. And I think my prediction is, but Marine Le Pen's support will not disappear. There's always going to be a large following for the National Front in France. And then we have an election in Germany coming up at the end of the summer. And there was just a state election in Germany which showed that Angela Merkel's party was doing better than most people had thought, and that her new opponent in the Social Democratic Party is doing worse than most people thought. So it looks like she's going to be re-elected for a 4th term and potentially become the leader of the free world.
So should the UK leave the European Union, and if it were to get a bilateral trade agreement with the United States, do you believe that would push more European countries to leave the EU, knowing that they would still have access to the US market?
It depends on the terms of the agreement they got with the United States, but I would rather be a member of a group of 500 million people negotiating with the Americans or the Chinese or the Japanese than a member of a group of 60 million, potentially 50 million once Scotland disappears. The British are going to have, the British will have a kind of an inside track because of the historical close relationship between Britain and the United States. But I don't think they're going to have anything like the negotiating position by themselves that they have as part of the European Union.
Great, we have some more text questions. Could you comment on student mobility between the United Kingdom and mainland Europe and how that will change after potentially Brexit happens?
That's been one of the great successes of European integration, is the fact that there are these programs, the biggest of which is called the Erasmus program, which provides funding support for students to move from their home country to other countries to get education. So they can do their bachelor's degree in their home country and then go to get a master's degree or something like that in another country. So there's been a lot more student mobility. That will be impacted. The British will not have the same kind of opportunities within that as they do now. Having said that, there are many students within the EU who are not from the 28 countries that do benefit from these programs anyway. So British students would continue to do that. There's the faculty exchanges and the movement of faculty among different countries. That's going to be changed fundamentally. It's not going to be as easy for an academic in Britain to become a professor in France or Portugal or whatever, as is the case now. And then there is another program which the Council of Europe, which is another institution, has promoted called the Bologna process, which is a credit transfer system. So if you take courses in one country, that you can transfer your credits to another country without going through lots of bureaucratic rigmarole. They'd still have access to that because Britain is still part of the Council of Europe. But a lot of people have been speculating with some concern about what's going to happen with student and faculty exchanges and research funds, which are going to dry up. A lot of research money that's spent from the European Commission will not be available anymore to British academics.
I was just wondering, perhaps, it doesn't appear to me that American adventurism abroad is going to be curbed by the current administration. And I was wondering if perhaps new bilateral negotiations with the United Kingdom could further ensnare them in some of America's previous engagements abroad.
So you mean, is something going to happen to Britain's defense commitments as a result of leaving the EU?
Oh yes, I mean defense commitments to the United States.
Right.
If our trade negotiations with them are now strengthened in an individual way.
Well, again, it's all speculative, but Britain's military ventures have been independent of the EU, so they would have probably have happened whether Britain was in the EU or not, because there is no European Union military. And Britain's military obligations to NATO are more important in political calculations than its obligations to the rest of the European Union. So, but I think post-Iraq and post-Afghanistan, I think a British Prime Minister is going to have a real problem trying to convince the British people to get involved in a military operation that is not at least supported by the United Nations, not something that just go and follow the Americans. You've got to have everybody else on board before we do this. So I think, yeah, but that's a whole separate set of lessons. But definitely Britain's view about military engagements is very different from what it was prior to Iraq and Afghanistan.
Thank you.
Sure.
This comes from the audience again. Thinking about some of the criticisms or the rationale for leaving the EU in terms of Brexit, what about criticisms of the European Union as being undemocratic? Can you comment on that a little bit?
Right, which is a frequent criticism. It's difficult to answer this without giving you a 75-minute outline of how the EU institutions work. There are 5. One of them is elected. So the European Parliament is a directly elected institution, so we can take them out of the calculation. One of them is the Court of Justice, which you don't elect constitutional courts typically anyway, so it's there to protect the treaties, which are the European equivalent of the Constitution. So I think we can kind of take them out of the arrangement. There's a bureaucratic body called the European Commission, which comes under particular criticism, but is routinely misunderstood in terms of what it can do. It has no independent powers. It can only do what the member states allow it to do. And its job is, it's a bureaucracy. Its job is to oversee the implementation of European Union law and policy. But the way that the Brexit campaign portrayed this last summer was that there's these crazy unelected bureaucrats in Brussels who run everything. Well, first of all bureaucrats are unelected. So that's a misnomer to begin with. And then secondly, these bureaucrats do not have those kinds of powers. So there are 2 other institutions. One's the European Council, which consists of the 28 heads of government. It's like a steering committee of the EU. But these are the elected heads of government of the 28 countries. So what's undemocratic about that? And then the other institution is called the Council of Ministers, which has a big role in deciding which laws to adopt and which not to adopt. And it consists of government ministers from each of the 28 countries, all of whom are indirectly elected. So actually, if you look at how these people get their positions, none of them get into office and have the sort of powers that make them responsive in some fashion. There's always either direct or indirect responsibility, and ultimately they are all responsible to the treaties that are the foundation of the European Union. So actually Andrew Moravcsik, who wrote this article, he's become very... one of his lines of research has been on how there is no democratic deficit in the European Union. And he makes some very convincing arguments to how public opinion and public views are actually quite well represented at the level of the European institutions, and I agree with him.
You all are shy tonight and making me do all the work. I've gotten tons of questions, but I think maybe you could comment a little bit about Theresa May and what her next steps are, and what can she do, really?
Ah, dear, oh dear, oh dear. Yeah, it's a tough one. I never liked her. I don't like her now. And as the days go by, I like her less and less. And the main reason why, in terms of Brexit, is that she campaigned for Britain to stay, but she did it in a very understated, unconvincing fashion. And now that she's become Prime Minister, she's decided that Brexit is Brexit, and it's going to be pretty much, what's called hard Brexit. She tried to negotiate what's called a soft Brexit, which meant that Britain would get all the good things about staying in the EU without actually being in the EU, which was an absurd request to make in the first place. So hard Brexit means just simply leaving and undoing all of the ties. But how is she going to do this? She's been very unspecific about exactly what's going to happen over the next 2 years, what her goal is, what a post-Brexit Britain would look like. She's been very rude to the Scottish First Minister, essentially telling her that she has no business deciding whether Scotland has another referendum or not, which is not true. If the Scottish government wants to have a referendum, they can go ahead and do that. She just seems to be making it up as she goes along. And to some extent, I can kind of sympathize, because this is uncharted territory. Nobody's ever done anything like this before. And nobody knows what the end state is going to be. Nobody knows what the goals are going to be. It's just, okay, starting this week, the clock starts ticking, and then there's 2 years to get to Brexit. And what is Brexit going to look like? Nobody has any idea. There's just a whole bunch of vague ideas out there. And I just don't think she's providing very much leadership in this regard.
Hi, thanks for coming out tonight.
Sure.
I just wanted to ask a little bit about your opinion on Turkey and their hopeful, maybe eventual ascension into the EU. Now it's looking a little bit less likely
Right.
that they will even be considered any longer. They have a referendum coming up next month to possibly give their current president more power and a longer stay. So just if you could talk a little bit maybe about their possible future.
Been interested in European Economic Community / European Union membership from the 1960s. They were accepted as a candidate country, I think, in 1987. So they've been in this sort of waiting room for a long, long time. And they've been becoming increasingly frustrated at what they see as intransigence on the part of the other European Union countries, who I think have deliberately tried to slow the process down, because I think a lot of the current EU countries are very nervous about the idea of Turkey becoming a member. So Turkey's got several things working against it. First of all, it's a very big country in terms of population. If it was like Albania, which is a much, much smaller country, also Muslim, Albania has been accepted as a candidate country, but Turkey is not just a big country, it's a poor country. So to absorb a big, poor country would be put enormous pressure on the European Union budget. It's a Muslim country, and people don't like to talk about it, but it's the elephant in the room. It's a part of the conversation. If it was a big non-Muslim country, it might have fewer difficulties. Even though it's a secular Muslim country, and even though the European Union is considers itself to be a secular organization, the idea of integrating this big, poor Muslim country, I think, sends shivers up the spines of many other Europeans. And now, with the changes that have taken place, the sort of trend towards authoritarianism, I have a feeling that quite a few people in Brussels are sighing a big sigh of relief, breathing a big sigh of relief, because they think, now we've got a justifiable reason to keep them out. So I don't think that Turkey's going to get in. 4 or 5 years ago, I'd have said Turkey might get in the next 15, 20 years. But the way things are headed now, I just don't think it's going to happen for the foreseeable future.
Hi. So I have a question about whether, if Brexit was done over again, if they took another vote, would it pass again? Because I think I remember reading somewhere that people were saying, yes, they still would vote against it. And I'm wondering if that's true or if I'm just remembering that incorrectly. Because if your hypothesis is that they just aren't knowledgeable enough, are they more knowledgeable now? And would they think, okay, I shouldn't vote for this?
Well, they are more knowledgeable because there's been much more attention paid to the EU since the Brexit vote. So there's been this huge mass education campaign, which was never intended or designed as such. But there's been 5 or 6 polls done in Britain since Brexit, all of which asked, what would you vote today? And all of them have said, we'll stay, by a margin of 52 to 48, 55 to 45. So they regret the vote. Apparently. But the question here is, can we any longer trust polls? Because polls are getting it wrong time after time after time. So, I mean, they got the presidential election here wrong to some extent. They got Brexit wrong. There have been other indicators where the polls just... The last British general election, they got the results of that one wrong. So it's really difficult to know, but I have a feeling that if they did have another referendum, say in the next couple of months or so, that you would probably find a significant number of people who regret doing what they did, didn't expect it to actually happen, and now would like to take another shot at it and would vote this time to stay.
And this gentleman over here will be our last question for the evening.
I wonder if you'd speculate a little bit on U.S.-EU relations. It's very clear, I think, that the current administration is not particularly interested in multilateral organizations, as we've seen from Human Rights Commission, the UN, the TPP, NATO, EU, etc. And so there's bound to be considerable difficulty. I wonder if you'd speculate on some of that.
You know, it's still early in the Trump administration, but there's a pattern that I think I'm not the only person that's identified this, where Trump says he's going to do something, and then he tries to do it, and he realizes it's not nearly as easy or as simple or straightforward as he thought he was going to do it, so he then backtracks. So he's already backtracked on NATO, because he was quite rude about NATO at one point, and now he seems to be taking a different philosophy about NATO. My feeling is that it's just political and economic reality will determine what he does rather than what he says he would like to do. And if he's really paying attention, I think that many of the things that he would like to undo in terms of relationships with other countries are actually going to end up hurting the people that voted for him the most. So where NAFTA might have been a problem in one form or another, the relationship between the EU and the United States is the world's most important relationship. The US relies heavily on the Europeans rely heavily on the Americans. If there's one group of people the Americans don't want to upset, it's the Europeans. If there's one group of people the Europeans don't want to upset, it's the Americans. So I think just by virtue of the size and the reach of this relationship, President Trump is going to find policy made for him rather than him taking a particularly strong lead in a different direction. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks.